You can become measurably smarter than most college grads simply by becoming a self-taught learner. And this isn't just some overstatement. Over my more than 12 years of experience teaching all sorts of students as a peer-reviewed academic, an educator, and an entrepreneur, I've identified the main reason self-taught learners outperform those who simply go to school, get a degree, and stop there. And in this video, I'm going to show you exactly how to cultivate this as a habit to gain the ultimate competitive advantage that most people simply will never achieve. And that reason is self-taught learners challenge commonly accepted standards of excellence. Think back to when you were in school. For the most part, you were taught what to learn, when to learn it, and importantly, you weren't even told why you were learning it, which is why it felt boring, useless, and like a waste of time. Entrepreneur influencers such as Graham Stephan and Iman Gadzhi echo this exact frustration in their experiences with school, which led them to abandon school altogether, pursue a life of entrepreneurship, and embrace self-education with respect to practical skills they could use to make money in the real world. In other words, they felt strongly that their talent, energy, and effort weren't being channeled into the right activities. And so they had some desire for excellence. They simply couldn't tie that desire to anything school had to offer. Okay, that's all good and well, but I also want to set the record straight here, because in our modern age of social media, this is the dominant narrative people listen to. They look at these types of influencers I mentioned, as well as people like Mark Zuckerberg or Bill Gates, both of whom dropped out of college, and they start to engage in what's called survivorship bias. In other words, they take a look at a tiny slice of a huge data set, in this case, people who dropped out of college yet made millions or billions, and conclude from that school is worthless, and that true excellence can't be found in the academic world. In fact, that's exactly what Graham Stephan, Iman Gadzhi, and a whole host of finance bro influencers argue. But hold up a bit, because it's important to understand what we truly mean by excellence and how rejecting mainstream standards of excellence does lead to success. You see, the facts are the facts. The data are the data, whether we like it or not. And if we want to make good decisions, we have to make data-driven decisions. And what the data show is clear. Those who get a college degree earn more than those who don't overall. And even if we narrow this data set only to entrepreneurs, it turns out most successful entrepreneurs also have a college education. But then if this is true, why do I claim that self-taught learners outperform college grads? Well, it's because self-taught learners, the highest performing ones, all have what you might call a holistic understanding of intelligence. They understand, as the philosopher Plato did, that excellence has multiple parts and multiple forms. But if that's true, what are these forms and parts, and how do we practice them as habits? Well, let's discuss the first of three parts: intellectual excellence. When I was attending Columbia University, I looked around me at my peers and noticed, for the most part, that everyone was simply driven to get the best grade they could, whether or not they even cared about what they were learning. They just wanted to get the grade in order to ace their major, in order to get into a corporate job, in order to get a house with a white picket fence and a nice car. However, there were a handful of students who thought differently. In particular, I recall one of my TAs who was studying chemical physics, and we would have incredible conversations about journal articles he was reading, ideas he was learning about, and so on, all of which weren't actually things he was actually assigned in his classes. Contrast that to another friend I had at the time. Again, another Columbia student that was sort of my study buddy. He would often and openly talk about how he just had to get through these classes so he could get into med school, which, don't get me wrong, is a noble goal. But he had no love for the knowledge he was learning. He had no actual curiosity about it. The knowledge was just a means to an end, like a dish rag, useful for wiping up a mess, but which would be thrown out after it stopped being useful. For this guy, he went on to be a doctor, sure, and if he has a decent life from it, great for him. But my TA's results were different. He's gone on to publish research and work with organizations that are making major breakthroughs that could have an impact on technology, industry, medicine, and more. And you see, research shows that this drive for excellence, this striving to create value and impact, is one of several factors that make self-taught learners so successful. They don't just stick to what they've been told to learn. They go above and beyond the curriculum, or even above and beyond their field. And most importantly, they truly love what they're learning. In other words, successful self-learners treat knowledge not simply as a means to an end, but instead as an end in itself. Okay, so that all sounds good and well, but if we're being honest, it also sounds a bit idealistic and romantic, don't you think? After all, what about all those entrepreneur influencers out there who talk about how we have to simply forget about school, leave behind formal education because it's a massive waste of time, and simply pursue education in the service of financial freedom? Well, here's where most people get it wrong. They either become like the typical influencer bro who trashes formal education altogether, or they go to the other extreme and become the typical curmudgeonly academic who sits in their armchair thinking that all people pursuing the goal of making money are dirty, mundane, or dumb. But what if both are somewhat right and somewhat wrong? What if excellence and self-education aren't black and white, but instead various shades of gray? Well, that brings us to our second of two forms of excellence: practical excellence. So what if you don't have a degree, or for whatever reason simply can't get one? Are you therefore simply locked out of excellence altogether and doomed to forever stare upward at the superior elites who stand above you on a shining pedestal? Well, I have some bad news for you and some good news for you. Let's start with the bad news. Once again, research shows that if we compare my unmotivated Columbia study buddy I mentioned before to someone who is an enthusiastic, self-directed learner, but who doesn't have a college degree, that unmotivated Columbia student will still tend to outperform that self-directed learner in terms of income. But then, what's the good news? Well, whenever we look at any data set, we have to be very careful in terms of what we can conclude because, and I emphasize, every data set has what's called variability. Put simply, although it might be less likely for you to outperform that unmotivated Columbia student if you don't have a degree but are simply a highly motivated self-learner, it is still well within the realm of possibility for you to do so. In other words, the data do not determine your destiny. In fact, research also shows that self-directed learners, regardless of education level, have a greater amount of what is called executive function. And this is just a fancy way of saying you have greater self-control. And this manifests in all sorts of ways, from the ability to set goals and plans of action to time management to emotional management, all of which can often compensate for the lack of a degree and put you in an even better position to succeed. In fact, it is these very qualities of self-directed learners that have been shown to sometimes result in greater income and very often result in greater overall well-being and life satisfaction. And this is often because of the real-world transferable skills self-learners tend to develop. And this fact is worth emphasizing. I experienced this effect firsthand back in 2013 when I first transitioned from being purely an academic to starting my first business. By failing miserably at it again and again, yet being willing to keep getting out of my comfort zone to hone my communication skills, sales skills, and so on, I've been able to leverage these skills to build systems for myself that have allowed me to essentially be a full-time philosopher, pursuing knowledge as a good in itself. And this is what most people don't understand. Namely, that this synthesis of different forms of excellence can be deeply transformative for your life, because each form of excellence and self-education nourishes each other, such that if you neglect one, it will inevitably affect the other. It's not about being a finance or crypto bro and rejecting traditional education altogether. And it's also not about being some elitist academic who views practical skills as just worldly and mundane. The reality is, whether or not you have a degree, simply by being a self-directed learner who goes above and beyond what you're told to learn, you become capable of being able to learn and achieve in a way that most people just never will. That is, you're capable of achieving both: one, intellectual excellence, or the ability to build knowledge that makes you a deeper, more intelligent critical thinker, and two, practical excellence, or the ability to build knowledge that makes you capable of building skills that can help you achieve financial stability and even financial freedom. Okay, then let's back up a moment. Because if you're not questioning some of my assumptions at this point, you're still totally missing the point. Sure, up to this point, we've peered a bit into how self-taught learners challenge commonly accepted standards of excellence. But can you see what I've been assuming all along yet, and why we should question it? Well, you see, at the start, I claimed that self-taught learners outperform college grads, but I never really defined what outperform truly means. I mean, we all have our own assumptions of what performance is, don't we? Yet, isn't it true that most of us assume performance is measured by income? This assumption, in fact, is so normalized that we are almost never aware that this is even an assumption we have. It's just too ingrained in our way of thinking. And that's why our third and final form of excellence is so important: critical thinking. You see, my TA friend from Colombia might have gone on to make a lot of money. I have no idea. But if you recall, regardless of income, he's doing something that my unmotivated study buddy at Columbia isn't. He's innovating. He's engaging in the creation and development of new knowledge, and he's contributing to the spread of that new knowledge for the purpose of making an impact on other people's lives. And I believe innovation can be construed broadly here. Yes, thinkers such as Albert Einstein, Bertrand Russell, and Nikola Tesla innovated in physics, math, and philosophy by actually synthesizing and creating new ideas and models. Yet athletes such as Simone Biles or musicians such as Yo-Yo Ma can also be said to be innovators in the sense that they created what we can call an exemplar. They created new examples of excellence for us to follow and strive for. And so as a self-directed learner, you really have to ask yourself, what does performance look like to you? Is it only about the creation of income, or is it also about the creation of value? You see, if you measure performance in this way, then the data set we look at needs to change. Because if that's the parameter we're now measuring, then yes, research clearly shows that self-learners outperform mere college grads on well-being, on life satisfaction, and many other measures. So yeah, we can look at the data all day, but do you see how your definition and how you're defining the question in the first place completely changes the data we measure? And so it's not simply some abstract question. In fact, critical thinking, that is regularly reflecting on the assumptions underlying your own definitions, and in this case, your definition of performance, is crucial to what both intellectual excellence and practical excellence are going to look like for you. For instance, once I realized performance for me meant 1, learning enough skills to run my own business so that 2, I could design a life in which I could study philosophy and science, then and only then did the exact skills I needed to learn become clearer and clearer to me. Without this kind of analysis, you'll always be strung along by what the philosopher Rene Girard termed mimetic desire, or simply valuing an outcome because someone else told you to. And so do you see how critical thinking helps you clearly understand what 1 and 2 look like for you? But if this pursuit of critical thinking is a key factor that makes self-taught learners so successful, then how can you develop it? Well, one way is by practicing what's called metacognition, or the practice of thinking about your own thinking. One method I've always used with my students to encourage them to develop metacognition as a habit, whether I'm in a one-on-one session with them or teaching in a classroom setting, is to challenge each other. And this is what I mean. I make it clear up front that just because I'm the teacher, it doesn't mean I'm right and can't be questioned. But at the same time, I tell students that whenever you give me an answer, you can't just guess or spit out any old random answer, because I will always tell you to justify your answer with the exact steps or reasoning you used to get there. I'll never let you off the hook. And you could do the same thing for yourself. In your learning process, it's so simple. Simply never let yourself off the hook. Force yourself to 1, explain your reasoning to yourself, and 2, explain why alternative reasoning or explanations don't work. Yet again, this is another way of holding yourself to standards of excellence and challenging the standards of excellence that most people hold, simply because they've been told to. Most learners won't do this. Most will simply regurgitate what the teacher told them to memorize. But this one small habit can truly make you exceptional because it forces you to be intentional about your thinking. And this one small habit will spill over to how you think about your decisions and your values more generally. What aspect of your own excellence are you currently working on, and what are you studying, learning, or educating yourself on? I'd love to hear about it in the comments. And if you want to keep leveling up your critical thinking to make a massive impact, not only on your own life, but also on the lives of countless others, then be sure to watch this next video.